Good morning from Manila, Jim Caruso. How are you? Are you still in New York?
I am still in New York for a while, and I'm thrilled to have another Aussie with us today. And you get to talk to her and introduce her.
Yeah, well, so before we get started, we are our podcast, of course, is why should we care about the Indo-Pacific, and this one is going to be why should we care about the AUKUS submarine, the AUKUS submarine, the AUKUS submarine. Now, Jim, I know you're a boomer, so go ahead and pick it up. Why should we care about? This is your song. This is your Jen.
I have no idea what you're talking about. I only
Well,
listen
okay.
to
Well,
classical music.
speaking of Jens, we have with us Jen Parker. Jen is a captain, U.S. Oh, excuse me, U.S. Royal Australian Navy, retired. She is now an expert associate at the National Security College at the Australian National University, and Jen has her own podcast called Maritime Matters. But we will forego the rest of the long introduction with all of her credentials and accolades and just say, Jen, welcome to our podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on. It's wonderful to be on.
All right. And I'm going to ask you the usual question. Why should we care about the AUKUS submarine?
Well, there's a lot of people that think we shouldn't. But look, I think Australia needs to care about it because it's a significant amount of the Australian defence budget. I think the UK, the US, and Australia need to care about it because it requires a national enterprise and really political commitment to make it happen. I think the Indo-Pacific needs to care about it because it does change some of the dynamics in the Indo-Pacific with Australia entering, I guess the capability of nuclear-powered submarines. So I think there's a whole bunch of reasons that both Australia, both the UK, the US, and Australia, and the wider Indo-Pacific should care about Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines.
Well, it's really interesting, Jen. When Ray and I were posted down to Australia, the decision had been made to buy these nuclear submarines from France and turn them into electric diesel submarines. Can you sort of discuss what the rationale of that was and why it was changed?
Yeah, look, I think that Australia's always had a pretty unique submarine journey. In fact, our submarine arm has been disestablished and re-established 3 times throughout our history. And considering that Australia's only been around as a country since 1901, that's a fair bit of change. And so, despite the fact that Australia had submarines during World War One, it wasn't actually until 1967 that Australia actually had a continuous submarine program. But one of the things about Australian submarines is we like to make changes. But no, looking at the Barracuda, I think one of the challenges was, as much as Australia has always wanted nuclear-powered submarines, and the debate goes back to the early 60s for Australia, where the UK actually wanted to transfer the technology to Australia, but the US said no. It's always been expected that Australia would never be allowed by our partners and allies to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. And it's not something that Australia would undertake by itself. Australia doesn't have a civilian nuclear industry. So when it got to the point of the decision of the future submarine to replace the current 6 Collins-class submarines Australia operates and has been doing now since the mid-90s, so they're aging out, the decision was made between a Japanese submarine and a French submarine to acquire the French Barracuda. Although it was designed to be a nuclear-powered submarine, it was accepted at that point that Australia would not be in a position to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, which makes it all the more interesting now, 8 years later, when that is exactly what we intend to do.
So, Jen, let's go back even further. So, I am going to show my vast knowledge of Southern Hemisphere geography. As I understand it, Australia is girt by sea, right? It is a very large country that is also a continent, roughly the same size as the continental United States, except for, again, on all sides surrounded by water. And what you're telling me is that for quite a long time, Australia has had a grand total of 6 submarines for all of that space. Why is that? I mean, so just from I am perversely sometimes referred to as a maritime security expert, as a 35-year Air Force veteran. Why is it that a country that is surrounded by so much water would have only 6 submarines?
Look, I think it's a little bit complex, but you highlight something that is really important to understand in terms of Australia's strategic history. So Australia is a massive island. It's also a continent. Australia has the 3rd largest exclusive economic zone in the world. and it is almost entirely dependent on maritime trade. So 98% of Australia's trade goes through its ports, and in fact 99% of Australia's internet comes through its subsea cables. So it is thoroughly dependent on the maritime domain. However, when Australians think about their strategic history, our involvements in conflict, they don't think about those maritime elements. They think about Australians at Gallipoli. They think about Australians on the Western Front. So Australia's always had this identity crisis that it doesn't really think about itself as a maritime nation, despite the fact that our sea lines of communication have been significantly interrupted during the world wars. So I think that's part of it. I think the next part of it is Australia is a bit unique in the fact that it is a huge maritime nation. I just gave some figures about how dependent on maritime trade Australia is, and I'll probably add another one that 91% of Australia's fuel is imported, which is crazy when you think about it from a resilience standpoint. Australia has a small population, so about 27 million, and compared to a lot of countries in the world, a small GDP. So Australia is always, because of its view of the maritime not being so prescient in its strategic history, despite the fact it should be, and because of its GDP and population, it has always underinvested in the maritime domain. So when the Collins class were acquired, they were acquired to replace the O-boats, which were acquired from the UK in the 60s through the 80s. We had 6 of them. Australia very much went, okay, well, we had 6 submarines. Our replacement is to replace it with 6. And there's been a bit of a history kind of throughout the Cold War in Australian military force design where it's kind of been replacing like for like, except for in the 80s when we got rid of our aircraft carriers. But we won't talk about that here. It's a sore point. So I think that's part of it. I think it's the misunderstanding of how important the maritime domain is to Australia. I think it's always having a kind of continental view of our strategic thinking, as opposed to a maritime view, and then kind of a force design history of replacing like for like. So that ended up with 6 Collins class submarines, which is, certainly not enough for Australia. And so that leads us to the 2009 white paper. And in many ways, the 2009 white paper for Australia, so that's a strategic document issued by the government, was pretty significant because it actually really reinforced how important the maritime domain was to Australia and sought to reinvest and recapitalise the surface combatant fleet, but also expand the number of submarines Australia is going to acquire. So it's going to go from the 6 Collins class that it had to 12 future submarines. Unfortunately, though, global financial crisis, much of the white paper wasn't funded. That said, in terms of the decision to go from 6 to 12 submarines, they did go to a competitive selection. In 2016, the French submarine was selected and the intention was to acquire 12 of those from the early 30s. But then along came AUKUS, and the plan was to change. Now, there is a lot of rumours, and certainly there was a lot of angst, I think, within the Australian Defence Department that the contract for the French submarine probably wasn't performing the way that they would like. Now, it's hard to say because there's not a lot out in the public sphere on this, but certainly the cost of that submarine continued to go up. So the cost was expanding. And there was a lot of concern about Australian industry content. So Australia does try and, when we acquire these capabilities, get some sort of support for our defence industry to be invested in that. And so there was a lot of concern, at least anecdotally, that the French submarine design and the French submarine planning was not factoring into its plans, the Australian industry content. So the project wasn't going very well from all accounts. And then we get to 2021 and AUKUS is announced and Australia is finally acquiring nuclear-powered submarines after, 61 years of Navy personnel lobbying for it.
So what was the decision process to go to a nuclear submarine? Because that was a huge decision strategically, financially, not to mention how it pissed off the French.
Yeah, well, it did piss off the French. That's true. So the French president called the Australian Prime Minister a liar in public. Look, how the decision process actually occurred is not entirely clear. And so this is one of the criticisms of the decision for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. So there was some stuff out in recent weeks where James Curran, who is a journalist for the Australian Financial Review, which is quite an influential paper in Australia, had said that it was all a bright idea from our previous Prime Minister, Scott Morrison. I think that's probably unlikely. There had been a lot of agitation within defence for a long time that this is a capability Australia should acquire, and purely down to the fact that when you look at Australia's geography, so if you have a conventional submarine and you want to get from Perth to Sydney, it's going to take you about 9 days. If you have a nuclear-powered submarine and you want to get from Perth to Sydney, even just at a speed of about 20 knots, it's going to take you 4.5. If you're boosting, it's probably going to take you about 3, right? Similar distances, if you want to get from Perth, which is where our main submarine base, or just south of Perth in Fremantle, to, say, for example, the Sunda Strait, where a lot of Australia's trade travels through, again, it's about 9 days for a conventional submarine. It's about 4.5 for a nuclear-powered submarine. So for Australia, there's always been a geographical problem and a time-space problem, which has always kind of promoted nuclear-powered submarines. So I think that when the decision came around, I think that there was a lot of disquiet, potentially, or certainly reported on, that the French submarine project wasn't going well, that the costs were blowing out, and it probably wasn't going to deliver the capability Australia actually wanted. I think the second bit of that is obviously that the Australian Department of Defence had socialised it, and I'm only assuming here, with their counterparts in the UK and the US. And unlike, in previous times, so in the early 60s, and again when it was reportedly raised in the 70s, they weren't immediately rebuffed, which probably seemed like a bit of an in. But there is a lot of criticism that the public didn't get the opportunity to really debate the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines, because the first they knew of it, in fact, to be fair, the majority of politicians and the Australian Department of Defence knew about it was when it was announced in September 21, because it was kept very close hold. And in James Curran's recent reporting, he said that Scott Morrison, the previous Australian Prime Minister, had said to him that they thought that if it was made public, the French would have gone out of their way to convince the US to scrap it. And after its announcement, there did seem to be a bit of a rebuke of Australia because the US had thought that this had potentially been resolved with France when it had not. So how the decision actually took place is not entirely clear. But I suspect it was a factor of the French project wasn't going well and it needed to be addressed. Obviously, the geopolitical circumstances in the Indo-Pacific, which you've covered so extensively in your podcast, are dramatically changing. And so there was an inroad for Australia to acquire this capability that there hadn't been previously.
So, Jen, let's just, for our listeners, talk about this distinction between diesel-powered submarines and nuclear-powered submarines. You just mentioned the difference in how long it takes for a nuclear-powered submarine to get from one place to another. Why is it that they can get there so much more quickly? And what are the other distinctions that make a nuclear-powered submarines more desirable than a diesel-powered submarine?
Yeah, look, absolutely. So I guess, and this is when you look at the size of Australia's maritime domain and you kind of talk about these concepts, it becomes quite obvious why Australia would always have wanted this capability. Now, don't get me wrong, not all Australians want it, and I think we'll get into that debate a little bit because there is a lot of risk. I think, the first one is just the endurance. So, for example, a Collins-class submarine at the unclassified space can go about 400 nautical miles without having to snore. Now, obviously, that depends on what kind of operations it's doing. If it's trying to evade.
Jed, I just want to enter snork. You just used a term. I want to go ahead and clarify that term.
Right. Okay. Yes. Basically, need to come up to just below the surface, effectively, to kind of charge your engines. It's not the best explanation. A submariner would give a better explanation, but basically, for a diesel-powered submarine, after a certain amount of time underwater, you need, and depending on what you're doing, right? If you're going at fast speeds trying to evade someone who's trying to prosecute you, then you're using your batteries more quickly. You're going to need to come up to effectively recharge, right? There's a better way of explaining it, but that's the cuff rate explanation of that. A nuclear-powered submarine, however, does not have that limitation whatsoever. So really, when it comes to a nuclear-powered submarine, in terms of the endurance factor, which is kind of the first key thing, is the main limitation is actually the crew and vittling the crew, right? It's not the fuel source. The second bit for Australia is then the speed. So I mentioned, those distances, right? And I think a lot of Australians forget about it, and a lot of people who have never been to Australia, have never worked with Australia, I saw a great paper released last year from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute of, what the US military needs to know about Australia, right? And the key thing is the distances. So I mentioned there, for a conventional submarine to get from Perth to Sydney, it's 9 days transit, effectively at about 10 knots. For a nuclear-powered submarine, they could do that at 20 knots or even faster. 20 knots is about 4.5 days. And so when you think about wanting to go up and either surveil or provide protection to some of the key choke points that Australian trade goes through. So I mentioned before, 98% of Australia's trade comes through its ports. 2/3 of that trade goes through the Indonesian archipelago, through key choke points, either the Sunda Strait or the Lombok Strait. For a submarine to get from Perth to the Sunda Strait, it's 9 days for a Collins-class submarine at about 10 knots. For a nuclear-powered submarine, it's 4.5 days at about 20 knots, and then it could go faster than that if necessary. So really, when you think about the attributes of a nuclear-powered submarine, there's a lot of other, but for the Australian geography, you think about the endurance, you think about the speeds. There's also the conversation in terms of loiter time. And so you can see why it makes sense for Australia from that perspective, and made sense for Australia even prior to the current geopolitical circumstances and the removal of, what we call in Australia strategic warning time.
So the other folks who are interested in this decision and were not consulted or given advance warning were, of course, your neighbors to the north.
Right.
And their immediate reaction was, we'll say, not positive, although they seem to have come around. What do you think their concern was, and why do you think they seem to have sort of accepted it?
And Jen, just to clarify, when Jim talks about neighbors to the north, he is in New York. He's not talking about the Canadians.
Well, to
Yes,
be fair, the Canadians weren't happy about AUKUS either, but that's another conversation.
Only because they don't have them.
Well, and I think they tried to get them in the 80s as well. I think there's a history there of being burnt on this. But look, I think that the way the decision was made and the way it was announced, so the three leaders coming together, which looked like the announcement of a war. And I think somebody told me recently, I can't remember, there's a Netflix series talking about an alien invasion. And in fact, they used the footage from the AUKUS announcement to announce the alien invasion because it's just so dramatic. So I think that in itself was provocative. Like, it was clearly signaling. There's other ways to announce that you're acquiring capability than doing that. I think the lack of public debate in Australia in the lead up to it, because it wasn't known, also meant that there wasn't a public debate in the region. So it caught many countries by surprise. When you think about Australia's countries to the near north, so we talk about Australia and Indonesia have a close relationship, but there's always ups and downs in that relationship. And a lot of those ups and downs tend to stem from not giving prior advice to either country about things that we intend to do, right? So that's Indonesia's constant criticism of Australia, that they're not necessarily told when Australia intends to do things. And that is Australia's criticism of Indonesia as well, historically throughout the relationship. So I think that when it was announced in that way, it seemed provocative. It wasn't consulted. And so, a country such as Indonesia that we actually have treaties with in terms of engaging and consulting on these kind of defence issues was taken a bit back. Also, when you think about the strategic position of Indonesia, they then raise questions about, Australian submarines transiting through Indonesian archipelagic waters, which, of course, in accordance with international law, they're able to do so, but it raises a lot of issues. So I think it was the fact that the region was caught unawares, and it wasn't just Indonesia that was critical. I do think that sentiment has changed substantially. There's probably one other element in that too that we've honestly got to call out, which is kind of the misinformation campaign and disinformation campaign that China led in the region about AUKUS, and their representations to the IAEA. So there was a push from China in the region that Australia's acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines was actually in breach of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and in breach of the Bangkok Treaty, which is the nuclear-free zone treaty effectively for Southeast Asia. Australia is not a signatory to that, but has kind of said we will comply with that. So I think that misinformation and disinformation from China, the fact that there was no public debate in Australia, and the fact that some countries who would consider themselves close to Australia weren't informed, really led to quite a negative response in the region. As you mentioned, Jim, that has changed dramatically with a number of countries coming out, both publicly but also privately, to support AUKUS. And I think a lot of that comes down to Australia making a concerted effort to really explain what the plan is, what's happening, why it's happening. And so we saw, in 2023, when the optimal pathway for AUKUS, so the plan for how Australia intends to acquire nuclear-powered submarines supported by the UK and the US, when that came out, there was a different response from the region. And I think that's because Australia had gone out of their way to consult that beforehand and explain what was happening. And so I think a lot of regional countries, and I travel a lot in the region, and certainly privately, it's acknowledged that it is a good balancing move from Australia in the region and actually can support stability in the region. So I think there is still a fair way to go, but the sentiment has changed substantially.
How does, Jen, the sort of confusion that a lot of people have between nuclear power and nuclear weapons, how does that play into a lot of the controversy surrounding the AUKUS submarine and sort of nuclear issues in general?
Well, it has been a substantial component of it. So actually, when Australia describes its acquisition, it actually writes them down as nuclear-powered conventionally armed submarines, which I've never heard anyone kind of go to the effort to refer to SSNs that way before. But I think that there was a lot of confusion in the region between the two. And I think some of that confusion was honestly stoked by Chinese misinformation and disinformation campaigns, right? That Australia would be acquiring nuclear weapons on its nuclear submarines. So I think that hasn't assisted. But I think too, if Australia had been more transparent about it in the lead up, these are things that could have been shaped before it was finally announced. So I think that a lot of that has kind of been allayed. I think there's been a lot of assurances provided by Australia that we're not talking about nuclear weapons whatsoever. We're just talking about nuclear powered submarines. But it was one of the challenges.
All right, let's get into some of the bricks that are thrown about this whole decision.
Yes, there's a lot.
There are a lot of bricks. You can build a whole house.
Yeah.
Let's start with the criticism that Australia can't afford them.
Look, so I think that there are a lot of valid criticisms of Australia's plan to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. I'm personally a supporter of it, but I think that it's a conversation about risk and how we manage that risk. So I guess what was unhelpful is when the optimal pathway was announced. So this is the plan for, phase one, which is Submarine Rotation Force West, based out of Fremantle, which is South Rockingham, where we'll have 4 US SSNs, 1 UK SSN rotating through that base from 2027 onwards. Phase 2, which is Australia's acquisition of 3 now. It was 3 to 5, but it looks like it's 3 Virginia-class submarines from the US, or purchase of, in the 30s. And then Phase 3, which is the joint project between the UK and Australia on AUKUS SSN to design and build a new submarine. I think when it was announced in 2023, there was a big faux pas by the government, I've got to be honest. So they mentioned this figure of $368 billion, and that has really resonated with the critics of AUKUS and the public. If you look up an Australian government document, you'll actually never see a reference to that figure, because inevitably the cost is not $368 billion. But it was mentioned in a press conference. So when you have a country that's going through a cost of living crisis, when we have a lot of pressures on defence, because, as much as nuclear-powered submarines solve some of Australia's issues, they certainly don't solve all of Australia's issues by far, that figure is easily attacked. So that's been unhelpful. There was then a concern, and this is where I probably personally, had I been the Prime Minister at the time, would not have necessarily decided for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines, is that the cost of that, and not just the financial cost, but also the workforce cost, the amount of investment you need to put into it, could potentially have a wider impact and skew the rest of the Defence Force, right? And so that's been part of the debate as well, in terms of, well, because we're buying nuclear-powered submarines and the cost of that, that would impact things like integrated air and missile defense for the Defense Force, the expansion of the Air Force, the expansion of the Navy's surface combatant fleet. I think one of the good things that the government has done, although they're not necessarily given enough credit for it, is that they have actually provided an uplift to the defence budget that does account for the cost of nuclear-powered submarines. So despite the fact that there's a lot of rhetoric around it, the majority of that project is not eating into what was the planned defence budget. It is an additional uplift that accounts for that. They have also announced since the optimal pathway the expansion of the Royal Australian Navy surface combatant fleet, which was announced in February this year. So I won't get into it for this topic, but this Royal Australian Navy has always been had a reduced size of surface combatant fleet. So 50 years of analysis says that it needs between 17 to 20 surface combatants, and that's before you think about the current geopolitical risk. But yet we've always had 11 to 12, and it's currently 10. So I think the announcement of the expansion of the surface combatant fleet and the additional funding for that as well has kind of allayed some of those concerns about how much nuclear-powered submarines will eat the rest of the Defence Force. But that is still a valid criticism, right? And it is yet to be seen as we embark further and further on this journey whether that will become a huge problem. So that's one of the main criticisms. But, the $368 billion announcement, I think that was a huge faux pas because it's most certainly not that. And even when that figure was interrogated, they said that, 50% of that is contingency. So for your average defence project in Australia, you'll have about 5 to 10% contingency, which is an additional buffer because we know that defence projects are complex and tend to go over their original estimates. Well, we're saying for that $368 billion figure, $120 billion of that is like, fudge factor. So I think it was unhelpful to announce that.
So talk a little bit about the process of going from a country that does not have a nuclear-powered vessel program to one that does. You're going to have to obviously spend a lot of money, but how do you develop the capabilities around that? What are the skills required for a country that to actually begin to operate nuclear-powered vessels?
Yeah, look, and this has been one of the significant criticisms as well of the nuclear-powered submarine pathway for Australia, that Australia does not have a civilian nuclear industry, although interestingly there is a debate right now in Australian politics about it. It is, I think, highly unlikely to get up. But, in terms of your nuclear engineers, your regulatory professionals, all of those sort of things, that kind of back-end, shore-based support, we just don't have. So there needs to be a lot of work with countries like the US, like the UK, to try and understand what that gap is and build that up. I think the good thing about the optimal pathway at the moment is that does actually seem to be happening. So there are a lot of, not only, there's lots of fanfare every time an Australian military officer graduates from a nuclear-powered submarine course in the US and UK, but we actually have a lot of Australian regulatory officials, Australian defence industry officials working in the US and UK to try and upskill in those areas so we can generate that kind of nuclear safety view and make sure we're across that. There's also the debate in Australia about what do you do when you need to dispose of the nuclear material. Australia's, well, when I say never had to do that, that's actually not quite true, but we won't get into the history of that, but certainly hasn't had to contemplate this for a while. And that's something that, as part of agreeing to the optimal pathway and agreeing to Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, Australia undertook with the US and the UK that it will dispose of its own nuclear material. And so working out how to do that safely and where to do that is also quite a challenge for Australia. So look, there is a whole spectrum of things that Australia needs to embark on. And again, this goes to one of the criticisms, right, which is the timeframes we're talking about. Is it reasonable for Australia to acquire all of these skill sets? And it's, it's not just a defence enterprise. In many ways, it's a national enterprise, right? Because you need to look at your immigration. Are you bringing the right people in that have the right skill sets? Your education. Are you training enough people in STEM so they can go off and get these degrees, etc., etc.? It is a national enterprise. And Australia hasn't always been good at recognising key defence projects as national enterprises, which is why our, continuous shipbuilding has always been a stop-start and a big problem for Australia. But I do think, in 5 years from now, my opinion might be completely different. But I do think since the optimal pathway is announced, there's actually a lot of things to indicate that Australia is embracing these things and seeking to upskill quickly.
Well, you already have some of your sailors, officers going through submarine training in the US. They've apparently done really well, including nuclear training. But this gives rise to the other criticism that some of these sailors are going to be stationed on American subs so they can learn how to operate it.
Mhm.
And the criticism is they therefore will be under the command of Americans. So if America decides to go to war, these people will essentially force Australia into declaring war. Now, without going into the niceties of how a country declares war, you are a naval officer. What do you do if you're under the command of an American sailor, American officer?
Well, I think this is a bit of a fur-fusion argument, right? So I actually was lucky enough to be the head of the warfare department on HMS Lancaster, which was a Royal Navy frigate for 3 years based out of Portsmouth. So, look, the idea of Australians serving in US and UK boats and vice versa is not new, right? Especially, you even look at Australian submarines in the Collins class. We have had US personnel serving in those ships, in those boats, sorry. Get my terminology right, otherwise I'll be reprimanded by all the mariners out there. And there have been Australians serving in US nuclear submarines and UK ships and potentially submarines. I'm not sure on submarines for a while, right? This exchange thing has always been the case. What we're talking about is it occurring at a higher magnitude. So I forgot his name. I think it might be James Packer. US official anyway came out and said, interestingly, this information doesn't come from the Australian Department of Defence, but that's a whole other podcast in itself. US official came out and said, he expected at one point there'd be about 440 Australian sailors and officers serving in US nuclear powered submarines. So that is an uplift to what we've experienced before. Normally, for exchanges like that, there are actually agreements between countries that before that unit goes to operate in what is declared as a war zone, there's a conversation, and sometimes the exchange personnel are removed. I think the question is, with the magnitude of Australians serving in US vessels, is that still going to be feasible to have that conversation and ask that question? It really comes down to how critical that position is to the boat and how much redundancy there is. And that's really hard to say as an outsider because, we don't know which vessels they're going to. We don't know what positions exactly they're filling. We don't know whether they could be removed and impact the operational capability of the vessel. But I think, more broadly, this exchange thing has been going on for a while. It does not mean that Australia, if the US engages in a conflict, it does not mean that Australia will agree that those personnel are engaged. And there are examples of this in the past. It means that there is a conversation, I think, about how essential those personnel are to that vessel and whether they can be removed, which is something that I have no doubt has been discussed before the agreement to get 440 Australian sailors and officers on nuclear-powered submarines.
Jen, one of the people you've tangled with a little bit on this question is a gentleman, a professor named Hugh White. For those of us who don't spend all of our time down in Australia, but have a familiarity with Hugh, there's an understanding that he does like to sort of occupy a very controversial space in the Australian national security discussion. Who is Hugh White, and what is his place in the overall national security discussion in Australia?
Look, Hugh White has a pretty distinguished background. He was a very senior official within the Australian Department of Defence. I can't remember the exact position, but let's say he might have been DepSec or Assistant Secretary of our Strategic Policy area. He was a key author of the 2000 White Paper for Australia. So he's not just an academic, he is somebody who has lived and breathed this stuff. When it comes to the maritime domain, most maritime professionals, so I think of the late departed Rear Admiral James Goldrick, who's probably Australia's most famous maritime strategist in recent history, sadly passed away last year. A lot of maritime professionals and academics take issue with Hugh's approach to thinking about the defence of Australia. He has some very certain views on the alliance, but more specifically, he has some certain views on how you should kind of close to defend Australia. You really need to, make it, a difficult area to invade and, close in to defend Australia, right? But the problem that maritime professionals obviously see with that, and we go back to that figure that I quoted before, about 98% of Australia's trade goes through the maritime domain. You can't do that. Australia's national interest exists offshore. And as much as you're not going to protect all of the trade coming to Australia, the critical seaborne supply, like your fuel, right? So I mentioned before, 91% of Australia's fuel is imported. In a refined state, that's from Southeast Asia. In an unrefined state, that's all across the Indian Ocean. Fertilizer, Australia, a huge agricultural country, depends a lot on importing fertilizer. Ammunition, you can list the things that are essential to Australia's economic viability and would be in the event of conflict that you would need to protect in the maritime domain. So Hugh has often had a view that Australia does not need many surface combatant vessels, for example. So he came out recently and said that the examples in the Black Sea, which is a very different geography to Australia's geography, very different problem set, demonstrate that Australia shouldn't be expanding its surface combatant force because USVs have made surface combatants obsolete. So Hugh has always had a view that Australia should not prioritise the Royal Australian Navy and that the maritime domain is not as important to Australia. So no surprise when AUKUS was announced that he was not supportive of AUKUS. And he had a recent paper out in Australian Foreign Affairs, very lengthy one, 46 pages, not a single reference in it, that talks about AUKUS. And his argument is kind of really hard to surmise very quickly because it kind of changes throughout the paper. In one point, he makes the argument that we could never possibly crew the 8 nuclear-powered submarines that Australia eventually have, but then makes an argument that the way Australia should do this is to get a significant number of conventional submarines. And I can't remember how many he says. It's 20 or 30 or 40 or some extreme amount. That the crewing of that is actually much larger than the crewing of 8 nuclear-powered submarines, and the cost of that would probably be pretty similar. He also makes an argument, as I said before in his piece, that if we're so concerned about the ability to project force, then what we do is solve the problem by just making Australia a harder thing to attack. And this is one of the challenges, right, in Australian strategic thinking, this whole idea of, well, what we actually have to do is prevent the invasion of Australia. Now, no one honestly takes seriously the concept of invading Australia. You just need to look at the geography of Australia to see how difficult that would be. In fact, the declassified papers from World War II show the internal debates in Japan that say, well, this is actually not a feasible thing to try and invade Australia. Yep, we'll bomb it. Yep, we'll try and cut off its sea lines of communication. But just geographically, you invade Australia from the north, well, you're marching through weeks and weeks of desert before you actually get to the main population centres in Australia. So Hugh, a really important person in Australia's strategic thinking, but has increasingly, I think, become anti many kind of mainstream commentary around the alliance and increased investment in the maritime domain. So he's critical of AUKUS on all fronts. My main rebuttal of Hugh was that I think that, he says, for example, well, you couldn't possibly support the workforce for nuclear-powered submarines, but let's go and get all these conventional submarines that need more of a workforce. It's the same problem set. The second is this idea, and this is where I take a lot of issue with a lot of Australian strategic thinkers, that to protect Australia, you just need to create a defensive bubble around Australia. Because I said before, if you think about Australia's key national interests, well, most of them, or a lot of those, exist off the Australian territory, and a lot of those exist in the maritime domain, right? And this became to the forefront last year for Australia, where the Houthis started attacking ships in the Red Sea. And, Australia's third largest trading partner is the EU, and the majority of that trade goes on ships and goes through the Red Sea, now obviously around the Cape of Good Hope. And many critiques said that's too far away from Australia for us to care about that. We've spent so much time with land forces embroiled in the Middle East, we don't want to be involved in that problem. Fundamentally forgetting that the maritime domain around the Middle East, which is where a lot of Australia's unrefined fuel comes from, is vitally important to Australia. And so closing off the Red Sea actually impacts Australia's trade. But even then, the government came out and said that it's outside of our primary military area of interest and we wouldn't deploy a ship there. So I think there's this real challenge to get Australians to realise that because we are so dependent on maritime trade means that we need to be thinking well outside the idea of defending Australia as an island.
I think the other thing that concerns a lot of people is Australia's history of acquiring new ships of any sort has been, we'll call it checkered. Um, the Hunter class frigates are well behind schedule and don't know when they'll be delivered, and they need to be designed. The ships that Levante had built before are often in dry dock with problems. So there's a lack of confidence, it seems, in Australia's ability to follow through, if not on the Virginia class and on the Australia UK subs that are in the future sometime. How do you respond to that?
Look, they are fair criticisms. I would say, though, that that is Australia's recent history, not its lengthy history. Australia actually has a pretty lengthy history of acquiring complex capabilities, building complex capabilities itself. You know, every time somebody, for example, challenges Australia's continuous shipbuilding, I go back to World War II and just beforehand when Australia built 60 Bathurst class corvettes and exported them to both India and the UK. But it is a recent problem, right? And I think that it's a valid criticism. Some of it comes from a lack of political commitment. And I think, you know, do the Australian political elites really have the same view on the threat in the region? I think some of it comes from the lack of accountability. So, yes, the Hunter class frigate, for example. So, Australia decided to acquire 9 Hunter class frigates. Going back to that 2009 white paper before that I mentioned that talked about the expansion of the submarine fleet, it also identified that the Anzac class frigates, which make up 8, now 7, one just decommissioned, of our 10 now surface combatants, so the backbone of our surface combatant force. In 2009, we said that they needed to be replaced. In 2018, the decision was made. So let alone the issues with the Hunter class frigate, it took 9 years for the government, both governments, both key parties. So this is not a current government issue. It's not a political issue. It's both parties to make a decision on that, right? And I think that goes back to that conversation we started with at the front that, you know, in Australian strategic thinking, we often underestimate how important the maritime domain is to Australia. So before the Hunter class frigate was even agreed to in 2018, we were already on the back foot. Then, of course, you know, there's been a number of audits into it. The costs have blown out, the timeframes have blown out, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that Australia agreed to acquire what was an embryonic design as opposed to a fully fledged design, and then decided to make a lot of changes, kind of the same approach that the US is finding with the FREM class frigate right now. And so I think that there had been a view that because we are a small force, we're kind of like a small boutique force, that everything needed to be the perfect capability because we don't have that redundancy in quantity. And so that, you know, there's another example, the offshore patrol vessel, which Australia has agreed to acquire and has built but hasn't commissioned. So, you know, we were getting 12 of them. We're now getting 6 of them. The first 2 are in the water, neither of which have been commissioned. The rumour is, although I honestly don't know, the rumour is that the issue is that Australia has insisted on too many changes to make them the perfect vessel again. So, yes, in recent history, I think due to a lack of political commitment, probably a lack of really believing the strategic circumstances are as significant as they are, and this obsession with getting the perfect capability as opposed to just a capability has hindered some of those key projects. There are a lot of examples of Australian defence projects in the last 20 years that have actually gone to plan and been under budget. But because the Australian Department of Defence doesn't necessarily engage the public on those and sell those things, all the public hears about is the Hunter class frigate issues and the French submarine issues. So look, don't get me wrong, I think the Australian public is right to be raising a lot of questions about AUKUS. Absolutely. You know, we've identified some key risks there in terms of the cost and the impact on the wider defence force, workforce risks, enterprise risks. It is a really significant challenge. But I think that AUKUS Pillar 1 really does need to be judged on its own progress whilst remaining sceptical. And I think that you can't deny the fact that right now it is on track. And a lot of those risks are known and they are being mitigated. Will that always be the way? Not necessarily, right? You know, once we get to the point where we're extending the life of the Collins class submarines, so the current Collins class submarines, the plan is to extend the life of all 6 of them with a 2-year upgrade that involves cutting the hull in half and replacing key elements, including the combat system. Yeah, that commences from 2026. So the Collins-class submarine is going to go through a life of type extension, 2 years per boat. High risk, so cutting the hull in half, which is significant for a submarine, commencing for 2026. We're going to be doing that whilst concurrently getting ready to bring the Virginias into service in the 30s, whilst working on the design of the AUKUS SSN and then the build of the AUKUS SSN. Like, there's a significant amount of risk associated with all of that. So I think the public is right to be skeptical, but I do think the good thing is these risks are known, they're being talked about up front, and there is an attempt to mitigate them. I think that is different to, for example, the Hunter class project, where it was sold as something, oh, we're just getting the same Type 26 as the UK, and not really sold as, actually, this is quite an embryonic design, and therefore there is a lot more risk associated with it. So I think they're different ball games.
Well, Jen Parker, this has been a fantastic tour de force on the AUKUS submarine and on Australia's maritime strategic problems and how it's approaching them. We really want to thank you for joining us. Where can people find your work, and where can people find your podcast?
Yeah, well, thank you. So I do a weekly podcast with Richard Dunley, who's a naval historian in Australia, called Maritime Matters. You can find it on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And another one, actually, because I love alliteration, called The Saltwater Strategist for the Australian Naval Institute, which you can get on all places that you check out podcasts. So you can find me there or on my my website, which I think is jennifertackparker.com or something like that. Just Google it and you can find my recent writings.
All right, Jen. Well, it's been, again, fantastic. Jen Parker, actual maritime security expert. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Well, that was really interesting, Ray.
Oh my, yeah. AUKUS was announced not long after we left, and honestly, I didn't see it coming. I was the defense attaché, and maybe I should have, but it was percolating along somewhere, and it came as a surprise to me, and frankly a pleasant one, because I really think that this level of integration between the U.S. And the U.K. and Australia is long overdue.
Well, you look, this is a huge gamble by Australia, and Jen talked about the amount of their budget going to these submarines. It basically ties Australia to U.S. in the delivery of these submarines. They're going to invest $3 billion in American shipyards to increase our output. They're going to be buying these subs from us, not lending them or giving them. They're buying them from us. So this is all a big bet for Australia, that this alliance with the U.S. is going to last for years, decades, and this cooperation will continue. If we let them down, they will be, they'll be mad, they'll be disappointed, and they may have to go a different way, and we will lose one of our most capable allies. Full stop.
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's obviously a very strong statement. I mean, it's Australia. There's no closer friend, right? I mean, again, I'm biased because of our time there, but I can't imagine any closer relationship, and really a real keystone to our position in the Indo-Pacific. So yes, this has to work. And between the US, UK, and Australia, we have to make it work. And so if we see, threats, whether they be political or programmatic or bureaucratic, we really have to, there needs to be leadership going on, for the next couple of decades into the future, to make sure that we don't let this thing fall apart, because this, we are now in this, and, to let this, fall apart or just not succeed would really be, I think, extremely damaging to perhaps, certainly one of our two most important Indo-Pacific relationships, just in terms of capacity, in terms of strategic position, so this really has to work.
Well, our cooperation with Australia, as you know, is so enormous. Of course, intelligence, our troops rotating through Darwin, ships calling on their ports now, and it's vital to our defense to have this relationship go on. It's also vital that we increase the number of submarines that we build. Australia is willing to help finance that. So those critics who say, well, we can't build enough, Well, that's not the point. The point is let's build more. Let's work with Australia to get that done. Not, oh, we give up, which is just so defeatist. I can't believe it. Might as well be Hugh White.
Yeah, this has been a recurring theme in our discussions, and of course, people would expect me as a retired military officer to say we need a bigger defense budget, but we need a bigger defense budget. I mean, to be honest, and again, a recurring theme: the way that we are funding defense right now, which is the way that we're funding most of the government right now, which is to say, we fund it on continuing resolutions that are not able to, so that our military planners are not able to look out into the future. We need not just a larger defense budget. We need a more predictable one so that we can actually make these long-term commitments and know how we're going to do these things into the future, rather than just kind of, sort of stumble along from fiscal year to fiscal year. So all that's true. And this is, this particular thing, though, I think, in terms of America's Indo-Pacific position, much like its position around the world, is going to be increasingly determined by the quality of our alliances and partnerships. And this is, there's really almost none as important as this one.
I think you've discovered a theme in many of our podcasts.
Indeed.
But you talk about the budget. I think one day it'd be great to talk to someone who's a budget expert, because the way our budgeting is done and the way our procurement is done, I'm convinced there's a lot of savings to be found. And for an example of that, you could look at SpaceX winning against Boeing in space launch capability. And they didn't take any money up front. So there's got to be a better way. And that'll never be hired by a defense contractor.
Absolutely.
All right. So, Ray, on that note, tell me a story.
Well, there I was. So I'm going to go, since we're talking about Australia today, I'm going to go back to Australia from my first days in Australia, where I was having to learn this whole new language called English. But, two countries separated by a common language was never more true than the U.S. and Australia. So when I first got there, I had a bunch of my things delivered from the United States, including things like a lawnmower and a barbecue grill. So the first thing that comes along is I've got this lawnmower in and I need to mow the lawn, right? Well, what do you need to mow the lawn? You need gas to put in the lawnmower. So when you transport your gas lawnmower to another country, you have to go and get gas. How do you get gas? You go and you get a gas can, right? You understand that, being another American. So I go down to my local Bunnings, and Bunnings, for my fellow Americans, is kind of like Home Depot. So you go down to Bunnings, and I walk in, and I realize walking in that there may be a translation issue here, because gas can just feels like an American term. So I'm standing there, and I'm looking for where the gas cans might be, and I'm talking to the Bunnings employee, and I say, gas can? And he looks at me and he just sort of shakes his head. And I say, well, so if you have gas and you need to put it into a lawnmower, and he's still looking at me. And finally, this friendly Aussie with a trolley is a shopping cart, comes walking by and says, petrol. And so, if you have to put the petrol in okay, aisle 3, right? So then, okay, so I got the gas can. No, it's a canister for the petrol. Okay, anyway, so we solved that. I got the petrol container, or whatever we called it, and then 2 weeks later, it's time to have a barbecue. Well, what do you need for a barbecue if you have a propane barbecue grill? So I walked down to the Bunnings. Having been chastised once, I know that I'm already in trouble walking in, and so I go up to the place where it looks like they might take care of this, and I say, I need some propane for, I need a propane tank. And their eyes get really big, and they said, do you have a license for that? And I said, for the barbecue? And they said, oh, a gas bottle. So I finally got my gas bottle. I got the petrol for the lawnmower, and I was to coin a phrase, I was indeed cooking with gas by that point. So, but certainly not with petrol.
That's why you have to use Google Translate, Ray.
Exactly. Well, as we all know, Australia is a place where you go down in the Arvo to get a burger at the Macca's.
Not a
So,
burger,
which,
or a Sammy, or a Sanga.
so yes, so all good. Jim, this gone on a little long, so I'm going to say farewell from Manila for this time. I want to once again give a shout out to our producer, Ian Ellis Jones. Follow him on Twitter, and say goodbye to you from New York. And I think next time you will be coming to us from a different state.
That's right. I'll be up in northern Vermont, near to Canada, see what they're saying up there.
All right. Well, I look forward to it. For Jim Caruso and Ian Ellis Jones, I'm Ray Powell, and thanks for listening to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?